If you don't walk in the Spirit, the flesh will control you. There is a quiet truth that many believers sense but rarely confront honestly. If you do not walk in the Spirit, something else will walk in your place. Life does not pause while you decide. There is no neutral ground where nothing governs you. Every thought, reaction, desire, and habit is being shaped by one of two forces, either the spirit or the flesh. This is not poetic language. It is a lived reality that determines the direction of your life every single day. Many people assume that faith alone guarantees spiritual control, but faith without daily surrender does not weaken the flesh. The flesh does not retreat simply because you believe the right doctrines. It withdraws only when it is actively denied authority. Where the spirit is not intentionally followed, the flesh does not wait politely. It steps forward and takes command. This is why so many believers feel trapped in cycles they cannot explain. They pray but remain restless. They worship but still feel pulled toward old habits. They read scripture, yet react emotionally in ways that contradict everything they claim to believe. This confusion is not accidental. It is the result of a divided life, one that belongs partly to God in confession, but fully to the flesh in practice. Walking in the Spirit is not an abstract spiritual idea reserved for mystics or mature saints. It is the daily discipline of surrendering control, of choosing alignment over impulse, obedience over comfort, and truth over desire. When this discipline is absent, the flesh does not simply influence you, it governs you. This teaching is not meant to condemn, but to awaken. If the flesh has been controlling areas of your life, it is not because you are weak or abandoned by God. It is because the Spirit cannot lead where He is not followed. The solution is not more guilt. The solution is clarity. You must understand the nature of the conflict before you can win it. In this series, we will confront the uncomfortable reality that many believers avoid. The flesh is not passive, and the Spirit does not force himself into leadership. Control always belongs to the voice you obey. Direction always follows the authority you submit to, and freedom only comes when the Spirit is not just acknowledged, but obeyed. We begin at the foundation by exposing how the flesh gains control when the Spirit is ignored, why the flesh always takes control when the Spirit is neglected. The flesh does not need permission to rule. It only needs absence. Where the Spirit is not actively followed, the flesh does not compete. It inherits authority by default. This is one of the most misunderstood realities in the Christian walk. Many assume that the flesh is an external enemy that attacks from the outside. In truth, the flesh is an internal force that rises whenever spiritual discipline weakens. The flesh represents the unredeemed patterns of thinking, reacting, and desiring that were formed before surrender to God. Though salvation changes identity, it does not erase patterns overnight. These patterns remain dormant only when they are denied influence. When vigilance fades, they do not knock, they reoccupy territory. Walking in the Spirit requires intentional alignment. It demands daily attentiveness to God's leading, restraint over impulses, and submission of thoughts before they become actions. When this attentiveness is replaced by routine, distraction, or spiritual complacency, the flesh fills the vacuum. This is not a moral failure first, it is a leadership failure. Something must lead the inner life, and the flesh is always willing. This explains why the flesh often appears strongest in moments of fatigue, emotional stress, or spiritual dryness. When the mind is tired and the will is unguarded, the flesh interprets this as permission. Old habits resurface, emotional reactions intensify, desires once controlled regain urgency. None of this is random. It is the predictable result of unoccupied spiritual authority. The flesh thrives on immediacy. It seeks comfort now, relief now, validation now. The Spirit, by contrast, leads toward long-term transformation, often through restraint and patience. When the spirit is neglected, the internal voice shifts from wisdom to urgency. Decisions become reactive instead of discerning. Life begins to revolve around how things feel rather than what is true. Many believers mistake this shift for personal weakness or spiritual attack. While external pressure exists, the deeper issue is internal leadership. The flesh does not overpower the spirit. It replaces him where obedience is withdrawn. The spirit does not compete for control. He leads where he is welcomed and steps back where he is resisted. This is why religious activity alone cannot restrain the flesh. Attendance, knowledge, and even service can coexist with a flesh-led life. The flesh does not fear routine spirituality. It adapts to it. What it cannot survive is daily surrender, moment-by-moment submission of thoughts, desires, and reactions to the Spirit's guidance. When the Spirit is not consulted, the flesh becomes the decision-maker. When prayer becomes optional, impulse becomes authoritative. When Scripture is read without obedience, desire becomes the interpreter. Over time, this creates a life that looks spiritual externally, but is governed internally by the flesh. This internal contradiction produces exhaustion. A flesh-led believer is constantly tired, not physically but spiritually. There is effort without peace, motion without direction, and activity without transformation. The soul senses something is wrong, but cannot articulate it. This discomfort is not condemnation. It is conviction signaling misplaced leadership. The flesh also distorts identity. When it controls behavior, it whispers lies about who you are. It uses failure to define you, temptation to shame you, and inconsistency to silence you. The Spirit restores identity through truth, but truth must be received daily. When neglected, lies become familiar, and familiarity begins to feel like truth. Understanding this dynamic is essential. The flesh is not defeated once, it is denied daily. Walking in the Spirit is not a one-time decision, but a continuous posture. Each day presents a choice. To live from surrender or from impulse, one leads to freedom, the other leads to quiet bondage disguised as normal life. If the flesh has been controlling your reactions, your desires, or your direction, the issue is not lack of faith, it is lack of alignment. The Spirit does not abandon believers, but he will not override their will. Control always follows submission. This is why the command is not simply to believe in the Spirit, but to walk in him. Walking implies movement, intention, and consistency. When that walk stops, something else takes over, and the flesh never hesitates. If this message is revealing something about your own walk, don't ignore it. This channel exists to help you grow stronger, clearer, and more grounded in the Spirit. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next teaching, where we will expose how subtle habits quietly strengthen the flesh and weaken spiritual authority. The flesh rarely takes control in dramatic ways at first. It does not announce itself with chaos or destruction. Instead, it advances quietly through habits that seem harmless, reasonable, and even justified. This is why many believers are shocked when they realize how deeply the flesh has shaped their inner life. Control was not stolen overnight. It was handed over gradually through small permissions repeated over time. One of the most dangerous misconceptions in spiritual life is the belief that only obvious sins empower the flesh. In reality, the flesh gains strength far more often through neglect than rebellion. It feeds on unexamined routines, unchallenged thoughts, and tolerated compromises. These do not feel like failures, which is why they go unnoticed. Yet each one subtly shifts authority away from the Spirit. A subtle habit becomes powerful not because of its intensity, but because of its frequency. What you repeatedly allow becomes what you eventually normalize. The flesh understands this well. It does not need to dominate your entire life immediately. It only needs access to small areas where obedience feels inconvenient. Once granted, it expands quietly, reshaping priorities, reactions, and desires. Consider how easily the flesh strengthens through distraction. When the mind is constantly occupied, the spirit's voice becomes harder to recognize, not because the spirit stops speaking, but because attention has been redirected. The flesh thrives in noise. It prefers a life filled with constant input, media, opinions, stimulation, because silence invites conviction. When stillness disappears, self-examination fades, and the flesh gains freedom to operate without resistance. Another subtle habit that empowers the flesh is emotional justification. The flesh excels at reframing reactions as personality traits or emotional necessities. Anger becomes honesty. Impatience becomes efficiency. Self-indulgence becomes self-care. Over time, these justifications form a belief system that shields the flesh from scrutiny. The spirit convicts gently but clearly. The flesh defends aggressively and persuasively. Unresolved emotions also serve as fuel for the flesh. When bitterness, resentment, or disappointment are left unaddressed, they quietly shape behavior. The flesh uses these emotions as leverage, influencing decisions and reactions without ever appearing openly. What feels like emotional self-protection is often spiritual avoidance. Healing requires surrender, and surrender threatens the flesh's control. Another habit that strengthens the flesh is selective obedience. This occurs when believers submit to God in areas that feel manageable, but resist Him where obedience feels costly. Over time, this creates compartments within the soul, some led by the Spirit, others governed by desire. The flesh does not need full control to dominate direction. Partial authority is enough to influence outcomes. The flesh is also reinforced by familiarity with spiritual language without corresponding spiritual discipline. When truth is known but not practiced, it loses its power to transform. The flesh adapts easily to knowledge without obedience. It allows Scripture to be discussed, analyzed, and quoted as long as it is not applied. This creates an illusion of growth while actual surrender declines. Comfort is another quiet ally of the flesh. When comfort becomes a guiding value, spiritual alertness weakens. The spirit often leads through challenge, conviction, and stretching. The flesh resists discomfort and seeks stability above transformation. Over time, a comfort-driven life becomes resistant to growth, even while appearing peaceful on the surface. The flesh also grows stronger through unguarded thought patterns. Thoughts shape direction long before actions do. When negative assumptions, fantasies, or fears are allowed to circulate unchecked, they form mental pathways that influence behavior automatically. The flesh operates efficiently in these pathways, guiding reactions before discernment can intervene. Many believers underestimate the power of repetition. What you think repeatedly, tolerate repeatedly, and excuse repeatedly becomes what you live instinctively. The flesh relies on this principle. It does not force you into major compromise. It waits for you to grow accustomed to small ones. Over time, conscience dulls, conviction softens, and resistance weakens. Spiritual neglect also plays a critical role. When prayer becomes rushed, Scripture becomes occasional, and reflection becomes rare, spiritual authority diminishes. This is not because God withdraws, but because alignment weakens. The flesh fills the space left by inconsistency. Leadership always goes to the most present voice. Another way the flesh gains strength is through comparison. When believers measure themselves against others instead of God's standard, discernment erodes. The flesh loves comparison because it reframes obedience as optional and conviction as excessive. If others are doing worse, the flesh feels justified. This mindset shifts focus away from growth and toward comfort. Even service can empower the flesh if it replaces intimacy. When activity becomes a substitute for surrender, the inner life stagnates. The flesh does not mind productivity. It resists transformation. It will gladly allow outward service as long as inward authority remains untouched. Over time, these subtle habits reshape the soul's default responses. What once felt wrong begins to feel normal. What once stirred conviction becomes background noise. The Spirit's guidance becomes less familiar, not because it is absent, but because attention has shifted. The flesh, once restrained, now operates freely within tolerated boundaries. This gradual shift explains why many believers feel spiritually distant without understanding why. Nothing dramatic changed, no major sin occurred, yet alignment slowly drifted. Authority quietly transferred. Control subtly shifted. The good news is that awareness restores power. The flesh loses influence when exposed. Habits lose control when examined. Alignment can be rebuilt the moment surrender is reintroduced. The Spirit does not require perfection, only willingness. If this message is uncovering habits you have overlooked, that awareness itself is an invitation. Growth begins where honesty replaces defense. Authority returns where surrender resumes. If you want to continue this journey and learn how to weaken the flesh and restore spiritual authority, subscribe to the channel. The next teaching will confront how daily choices either restore or surrender control, often without us realizing it. The battle between the spirit and the flesh is not primarily fought in dramatic moments of temptation. It is decided long before that, in the quiet, ordinary choices that shape direction. Most people assume control is lost when they fall into obvious sin, but in reality, control is surrendered much earlier, when discernment is replaced by impulse, when reflection is replaced by reaction, and when obedience is postponed in favor of convenience. The flesh does not need you to rebel openly, it only needs you to stop paying attention. Daily choices are powerful precisely because they feel insignificant. No single decision seems large enough to determine spiritual direction, yet together they form the architecture of the inner life. Every time you choose speed over discernment, comfort over obedience, or silence over truth, you are training your soul to respond without the Spirit. Over time, this training becomes instinct. What begins as a choice becomes a reflex, and what becomes a reflex eventually becomes character. The flesh thrives on reflexive living. It prefers automatic reactions because they bypass spiritual awareness. When you react instead of respond, the flesh is already in control. The Spirit leads through awareness, patience, and clarity. The flesh leads through urgency, emotion, and familiarity. Whichever voice you allow to guide your smallest choices is the one shaping your largest outcomes. One of the clearest signs that daily choices are strengthening the flesh is emotional reactivity. When emotions dictate responses without reflection, the flesh is operating freely. This does not mean emotions are wrong, it means they are powerful. The Spirit does not suppress emotion, but He governs it. When emotions lead instead of being led, discernment fades and impulse gains authority. Another daily choice that weakens spiritual authority is avoidance. Avoidance feels safe, but it is spiritually expensive. When difficult conversations are postponed, convictions ignored, or necessary changes delayed, the flesh interprets avoidance as permission. Each delay reinforces the belief that obedience is optional, and discomfort is to be escaped at all costs. The Spirit often calls toward what is uncomfortable, not because He desires pain, but because transformation rarely occurs within comfort. Time management also reveals spiritual leadership. How time is spent reflects what is prioritized. When prayer, reflection, and scripture are treated as optional rather than essential, the flesh quietly takes control of attention. Attention shapes affection, and affection shapes obedience. The flesh does not need to forbid spiritual disciplines, it only needs to push them to the margins. The way thoughts are handled each day also determines authority. Thoughts arrive uninvited, but they are not meant to stay unexamined. When negative, fearful, or indulgent thoughts are entertained without challenge, they gain influence. The flesh uses repetition to normalize what should be resisted. The spirit invites discernment, but discernment requires intention. Without it, the mind becomes a training ground for the flesh. Daily choices also include what you tolerate. Tolerance may appear mature, but unchecked tolerance erodes clarity. When small compromises are excused, standards slowly shift. What was once resisted becomes accepted, and what was accepted becomes defended. The flesh excels at gradual adjustment. It does not seek to shock the conscience, it seeks to soften it. Speech is another revealing area. Words shape inner reality. When speech becomes careless, cynical, or reactive, it reinforces flesh-led thinking. The spirit produces speech that reflects truth and restraint. The flesh favors expression without accountability. Over time, what is spoken casually becomes what is believed deeply. Even rest can either strengthen the spirit or empower the flesh, depending on intention. Rest that restores alignment creates clarity. Rest that becomes escape reinforces avoidance. The flesh uses rest to disengage from responsibility. The spirit uses rest to restore strength for obedience. The difference is subtle but significant. The flesh is also strengthened by justification. Each time a flesh-led choice is defended rather than examined, its authority grows. Justification silences conviction and reframes compromise as wisdom. The spirit convicts without condemning, but conviction must be received. When it is resisted, the flesh fills the gap with rationalization. Another powerful daily choice is how discomfort is interpreted. Discomfort is not always a sign of danger. Often it is a signal of growth. The flesh interprets discomfort as threat. The spirit interprets it as opportunity. When discomfort is avoided reflexively, growth is postponed indefinitely. Over time, this avoidance shapes a life that is safe but stagnant. The cumulative effect of daily choices explains why many believers feel spiritually distant, even while remaining morally upright. The flesh does not always lead into immorality. Sometimes it leads into distraction, busyness, and emotional reactivity. These do not feel sinful, but they are effective at weakening spiritual authority. Walking in the Spirit is not about intensity, it is about consistency. It is the repeated decision to pause, discern, and submit. Each pause weakens the flesh. Each moment of awareness restores authority. Each act of obedience, no matter how small, strengthens alignment. The flesh resists this kind of living because it limits autonomy. The Spirit does not remove freedom, he redirects it toward life. The flesh promises control, but delivers confinement. The Spirit invites surrender and produces freedom. If daily choices have been made without reflection, it is not too late to realign. Awareness restores agency. Attention restores authority. Surrender restores leadership. If this teaching is helping you recognize how daily decisions shape spiritual control, subscribe to the channel. The next message will reveal how walking in the Spirit restores clarity, authority, and inner stability, even in a world designed to keep you distracted. One of the greatest deceptions in the spiritual life is the belief that freedom comes from self-control alone. Many believers exhaust themselves trying to manage the flesh through discipline, routines, and willpower, only to discover that the flesh adapts, waits, and resurfaces. This happens because the flesh is not ultimately defeated by effort, it is displaced by authority. And authority is not produced by striving, but by alignment with the Spirit. The flesh understands effort very well. It can mimic discipline, tolerate routine, and even cooperate temporarily with moral behavior. What it cannot survive is surrendered authority. As long as control remains centered in the self, the flesh remains active, negotiating boundaries and waiting for moments of weakness. When authority shifts fully to the Spirit, The flesh loses its position of leadership, even if it does not disappear entirely. Many people confuse behavioral improvement with spiritual victory. They assume that because certain actions have changed, the flesh has been conquered. But behavior is often the last area to reflect a deeper shift. True change begins internally, at the level of authority. When the Spirit governs the inner life, behavior follows naturally. When behavior is modified without internal surrender, the flesh simply reorganizes its influence. This is why long-term victory over the flesh requires more than resisting temptation. It requires replacing leadership. Resistance alone keeps the flesh relevant. Authority renders it secondary. The Spirit does not merely help you fight the flesh. He leads you beyond its control. The transition from flesh-led living to Spirit-led living is subtle but profound. It begins when you stop asking how to control yourself and start asking who is leading you. Self-control is a fruit of the Spirit, not a product of the flesh. When you attempt to manufacture it independently, you reinforce the very system you are trying to escape. Walking in the Spirit restores authority by reorienting the inner life around surrender rather than management. Instead of negotiating with desire, you submit desire. Instead of reacting to emotion, you bring emotion under truth. Instead of trusting instinct, you pause for discernment. Each of these choices shifts authority incrementally. The flesh resists this shift because it thrives on autonomy. It wants you to remain the center of decision-making, even if you are exhausted. The Spirit invites you to step out of that center and allow divine guidance to lead. This is not loss of control. It is transfer of control to a higher authority. One of the clearest signs that authority is being restored is the return of inner clarity. Confusion diminishes, compulsion weakens, the constant internal debate quiets. This does not mean temptation vanishes, but it loses urgency. The flesh speaks loudly when it believes it has authority. When it loses that authority, its voice becomes easier to recognize and resist. Another sign is the shift from reaction to response. Flesh-led living is reactive. Spirit-led living is responsive. Reaction bypasses wisdom. Response invites it. This difference alone transforms relationships, decisions, and emotional stability. The flesh reacts to protect itself. The Spirit responds to align with truth. Authority is also restored through consistency rather than intensity. The flesh is intimidated by consistency because it cannot exploit it easily. Intense moments of spiritual focus followed by long periods of neglect do not weaken the flesh. They confuse it temporarily. Daily alignment starves it steadily. The Spirit restores authority by reshaping desire rather than suppressing it. Suppression creates pressure. Transformation creates freedom. When desire is submitted regularly, it loses its power to dominate. The flesh depends on unexamined desire. When desire is exposed to truth, its grip loosens. Another critical aspect of restored authority is humility. Humility is not self-rejection, it is accurate self-placement. When you recognize your dependence on the Spirit, you stop trusting your own impulses as final authority. This dependence is not weakness, it is wisdom. The flesh equates independence with strength. The Spirit reveals dependence as alignment. Authority is also strengthened through obedience in unseen moments. Private obedience builds internal leadership. The flesh prefers visible action without internal surrender. The Spirit values obedience when no one is watching, because that is where authority is established. As authority shifts, inner resistance changes shape. Instead of fighting yourself constantly, you begin to notice alignment increasing. Decisions feel clearer, boundaries feel firmer, peace becomes more consistent. This peace is not emotional numbness, it is spiritual stability. The flesh does not disappear when authority is restored, but it loses its governing role. It becomes a voice rather than a commander. Temptation becomes a suggestion rather than a demand. This is the difference between bondage and freedom. Many believers never experience this level of freedom because they try to defeat the flesh without surrendering authority. They fight symptoms instead of addressing leadership. When leadership changes, everything else reorganizes. Walking in the Spirit is not about becoming perfect. It's about becoming aligned. Alignment produces authority. Authority produces freedom. Freedom produces transformation. As authority continues to shift from the flesh to the spirit, one of the first internal changes many people notice is resistance to old patterns that once felt automatic. This resistance is not forced. It emerges naturally as alignment deepens. The flesh depends on familiarity. When familiarity weakens, its influence diminishes. What once felt inevitable now feels optional. This is not because temptation disappears, but because obedience becomes internally supported rather than externally imposed. This stage is often misunderstood. Some mistake the reduction of inner struggle for spiritual complacency, but in reality, it signals restored leadership. Constant internal conflict is not a sign of strength. It is often evidence of divided authority. When the Spirit governs, there is still discernment, but less internal chaos. Decisions feel cleaner, boundaries feel clearer. The mind is no longer negotiating endlessly with desire. One of the most profound effects of restored authority is the transformation of motivation. Flesh-led living relies heavily on pressure. Pressure to perform, to improve, to avoid failure, to maintain image. Spirit-led living replaces pressure with conviction. Conviction moves you forward without panic. It does not rush, but it does not hesitate. This shift alone brings deep relief to the soul. The flesh resists this change because pressure keeps it relevant. When pressure fades, the flesh loses one of its primary tools. Fear-based motivation weakens. Guilt-driven effort loses momentum. The Spirit leads through clarity rather than coercion. When clarity becomes familiar, manipulation loses power. Another area deeply affected by restored authority is decision-making under stress. Stress exposes leadership quickly. In flesh-led systems, stress amplifies impulsivity. In Spirit-led systems, stress invites dependence. This does not mean stress feels pleasant, but it no longer destabilizes identity. The Spirit anchors the inner life so that external pressure does not hijack direction. Authority restoration also reshapes how failure is processed. The flesh uses failure as evidence of unworthiness. The Spirit treats failure as information. When authority is flesh-based, failure produces shame and withdrawal. When authority is Spirit-based, failure produces correction and growth. This difference determines whether setbacks weaken or strengthen you. Another subtle but powerful shift occurs in how silence is experienced. Flesh-led living often fears silence because silence invites self-examination. Noise provides distraction. When authority is restored, silence becomes restorative rather than threatening. The Spirit uses silence to clarify, not condemn. This change signals that the inner life is becoming safer territory. Relationships are also affected. Flesh-led authority seeks control, validation, or protection through others. Spirit-led authority allows connection without dependence. Boundaries strengthen. People-pleasing weakens. Approval loses its grip. This does not produce isolation. It produces healthier connection rooted in truth rather than need. The flesh strongly resists this relational shift because dependency strengthens its influence. When identity and authority are internal, external manipulation loses power. The Spirit restores authority by stabilizing the self so that relationships are chosen, not required for validation. Another critical marker of restored authority is patience. The flesh hates patience because patience removes urgency. Urgency fuels impulsivity. The Spirit cultivates patience because patience preserves clarity. When patience grows, reactions slow down and discernment increases. Life no longer feels like a constant emergency. The flesh often responds to this shift by attempting to create artificial urgency, fear-based scenarios, imagined threats, exaggerated consequences. When authority is spirit-centered, these tactics are easier to recognize. Discernment sharpens, emotional manipulation loses effectiveness. Authority is also reinforced through gratitude. Gratitude anchors the mind in reality rather than desire. The flesh thrives on dissatisfaction. The spirit strengthens authority by restoring appreciation for what already is. Gratitude does not eliminate ambition, but it purifies it. Goals become aligned with purpose rather than insecurity. As authority continues to realign, the internal narrative changes. Instead of asking, "How do I stop this behavior?" the question becomes, "Who is leading me right now?" This shift reframes the entire spiritual journey. The focus moves from symptom management to leadership clarity. The flesh resists this reframing because it exposes the real issue. As long as behavior is the focus, the flesh can negotiate. When leadership is the focus, negotiation ends. Authority must belong somewhere, and when it belongs to the spirit, the flesh loses its leverage. Another sign of restored authority is increased tolerance for delay. Flesh-led systems demand immediate relief. Spirit-led systems can wait because they trust direction. Delay no longer feels like abandonment. Waiting becomes active rather than anxious. This transforms how goals, healing, and growth are approached. The Spirit restores authority not by accelerating outcomes, but by stabilizing the process. Stability weakens the flesh because instability is its advantage. When emotional and spiritual stability increase, temptation loses its urgency. Over time, this new authority reshapes habits organically. Habits change not through force, but through disinterest. What once dominated attention now feels less compelling. This is one of the clearest signs that authority has shifted internally. The flesh may still attempt to regain control through subtle tactics, self-doubt, fatigue, distraction, but its influence is limited when authority is established. These tactics no longer define direction, they are simply recognized and addressed. Restored authority does not eliminate struggle, but it changes its nature. Struggle becomes external rather than internal. Instead of fighting yourself constantly, you face challenges with internal alignment. This alignment is the foundation of lasting freedom. As restored authority matures, a deeper transformation takes place. The inner life stops revolving around constant self-monitoring and begins to move from trust. Flesh-led living is exhausting because it requires perpetual vigilance. Every desire must be managed, every impulse restrained, every emotion negotiated. Spirit-led living replaces this exhaustion with orientation. When authority is settled, the soul no longer needs to police itself relentlessly because leadership is clear. This clarity changes how temptation is experienced. Temptation no longer feels like a threat to identity. It becomes a test of alignment. The flesh tries to frame temptation as evidence of failure, but the spirit reframes it as an opportunity to confirm direction. When authority is secure, temptation loses its power to intimidate. It becomes information rather than accusation. Another profound shift occurs in how truth is received. Flesh-led authority treats truth as pressure. Spirit-led authority receives truth as guidance. This difference determines whether correction produces defensiveness or growth. When the flesh governs, correction feels like exposure. When the spirit governs, correction feels like refinement. This is why some people resist truth even when they desire growth. It is not truth they fear, it is loss of control. The flesh equates surrender with vulnerability. The spirit reveals surrender as protection. Authority rooted in the spirit allows truth to penetrate without destabilizing identity. As authority continues to stabilize, emotional resilience increases. Emotions are still felt fully, but they no longer dictate direction. Sadness does not collapse identity. Anger does not seize leadership. Joy does not override discernment. Emotional experience becomes integrated rather than dominant. This integration is one of the clearest markers of spirit-led authority. The flesh strongly resists emotional integration because fragmented emotion gives it leverage. When emotions operate independently of truth, the flesh can use them to redirect behavior. When emotions are acknowledged but not obeyed blindly, their influence becomes constructive rather than controlling. Another critical change appears in the relationship with time. Flesh-led living experiences time as pressure. There is always a sense of being behind, rushed, or late. Spirit-led authority restores a sense of timing. Patience replaces panic. Discernment replaces urgency. Decisions are made from alignment rather than fear of missing out. This shift in timing undermines one of the flesh's most effective tools: haste. Haste forces decisions without reflection. The spirit rarely leads through haste. When authority is spirit-centered, haste becomes easier to recognize and resist. This alone prevents countless misaligned choices. Authority restoration also reshapes ambition. Flesh-driven ambition seeks validation, recognition, or escape. Spirit-led ambition seeks alignment with purpose. Goals remain, but their emotional charge changes. Success is no longer required to prove worth. Failure no longer threatens identity. Ambition becomes an expression of calling rather than compensation for insecurity. The flesh resists this transformation because insecurity is one of its primary sources of influence. When insecurity weakens, manipulation loses power. The spirit restores authority by grounding worth internally rather than externally. Another area deeply affected is the inner narrative. Flesh-led authority produces constant commentary, self-criticism, comparison, projection, and fear-based forecasting. Spirit-led authority quiets this noise. Thought becomes more deliberate. Silence becomes less threatening. The mind becomes a place of clarity rather than conflict. This does not mean the mind becomes empty. It becomes ordered. The spirit does not remove thought. He aligns it. When thought is aligned, it supports obedience instead of sabotaging it. Authority restoration also brings a renewed relationship with discipline. Discipline stops feeling like punishment and begins to feel like protection. Boundaries are no longer resented. They are appreciated. The flesh hates boundaries because boundaries limit autonomy. The spirit reveals boundaries as the framework of freedom. This is where many believers experience their greatest breakthrough. They stop viewing obedience as restriction and begin to experience it as relief. Relief from confusion, relief from internal conflict, relief from self-negotiation. Authority brings rest because leadership is no longer contested. As this rest deepens, spiritual consistency becomes sustainable. Practices such as prayer, reflection, and scripture stop feeling forced. They become natural responses to alignment. The flesh loses influence not through suppression, but through irrelevance. This does not mean vigilance ends. Awareness remains essential, but vigilance shifts from fear-based monitoring to calm attentiveness. The spirit does not ask for anxiety. He invites awareness. When awareness is present, authority remains stable. The final evidence of restored authority is peace that persists through uncertainty. This peace is not situational. It does not depend on outcomes, clarity, or comfort. It flows from alignment. The flesh cannot manufacture this peace. It can imitate calm temporarily, but it cannot sustain peace under pressure. This peace confirms what has shifted internally. Leadership has changed, authority has been restored. The Spirit is no longer consulted occasionally, he is followed consistently. This is the heart of walking in the Spirit, not perfection, not effort, not constant struggle, but alignment that produces authority, and authority that produces freedom. If this teaching has helped you understand how true authority over the flesh is restored and sustained, subscribe to the channel so you can continue growing in clarity, strength, and Spirit-led living. The ultimate consequence of not walking in the Spirit is not simply moral failure, emotional instability, or recurring temptation. The deepest consequence is captivity without awareness. When the flesh controls a person long enough, control begins to feel normal. Bondage disguises itself as personality. Limitation presents itself as realism, and spiritual dullness feels like maturity. This is the final strategy of the flesh, not to create chaos, but to normalize confinement. At this stage, many people no longer feel the urgency to change. The inner discomfort that once signaled misalignment has been muted by adaptation. The flesh thrives here because resistance has not been crushed, only forgotten. When spiritual sensitivity fades, captivity no longer feels like captivity. It feels like life. The flesh does not need to destroy faith to win. It only needs to redefine it. Faith becomes belief without obedience. Prayer becomes routine without surrender. Scripture becomes information without transformation. The external structure remains intact, but internal authority has quietly shifted. The Spirit is acknowledged but not followed. This condition is especially dangerous because it is stable. There is no crisis demanding intervention, no dramatic collapse forcing reflection. Life functions. Responsibilities are met, appearances are maintained, and yet direction is no longer Spirit-led. The flesh governs through habit, comfort, and emotional reasoning. One of the clearest indicators of this captivity is the loss of spiritual hunger. Hunger is replaced by tolerance. Instead of longing for alignment, there is acceptance of imbalance. Growth is postponed indefinitely. The flesh encourages this delay by reframing stagnation as contentment. Over time, the soul forgets what clarity felt like. Another sign is the normalization of internal contradiction. People learn to live with opposing values without resolving them. Truth is admired, but not embodied. Conviction is acknowledged, but not acted upon. This internal split creates fatigue, but the fatigue is misattributed to life rather than leadership failure. The flesh also controls through emotional management. Instead of being led by truth, decisions are made to avoid discomfort. Peace becomes the absence of conflict rather than the presence of alignment. This creates a life that feels calm on the surface, but lacks depth and direction. Over time, the capacity to discern the Spirit's leading weakens, not because the Spirit stops speaking, but because attention has been trained elsewhere. The flesh trains attention toward urgency, preference, and self-protection. Discernment requires stillness. Stillness threatens the flesh. Another consequence of flesh control is spiritual passivity. Initiative fades, courage weakens, convictions soften, life becomes reactive rather than purposeful. The flesh prefers reaction because reaction does not require surrender, it only requires instinct. This passivity often disguises itself as humility. People say they are waiting, but they are avoiding. They say they are trusting, but they are disengaged. The flesh reframes avoidance as wisdom to prevent exposure. The longer this state continues, the harder it becomes to imagine another way of living. Freedom feels theoretical. Transformation feels unrealistic. Stories of growth sound exaggerated. The flesh uses time as evidence. If change were possible, it would have happened already. This lie is one of the most powerful weapons the flesh uses. It convinces people that delay is destiny. that patterns are permanent, that effort is futile. The Spirit, however, never measures possibility by history. He measures it by alignment. The tragedy is not that people fail to walk in the Spirit once or twice. The tragedy is when they stop believing that walking in the Spirit is possible for them at all. At that moment, captivity becomes self-sustaining. Yet even here, the Spirit does not withdraw. He waits. He does not force leadership, but he never relinquishes availability. The moment surrender returns, authority can be restored. No amount of time cancels that possibility. Breaking free from flesh-dominated living begins with recognition. Recognition disrupts normalization. When captivity is named, its power weakens. The flesh relies on invisibility. Exposure destabilizes it. This recognition often feels uncomfortable because it confronts years of adaptation. But discomfort is the doorway to awakening. The Spirit uses discomfort to reintroduce truth. The flesh uses comfort to suppress it. As awareness returns, resistance follows. The flesh does not release control easily. It responds with doubt, fear, and fatigue. These are not signs of failure. They are signs that authority is being challenged. Walking in the Spirit at this stage requires courage, not perfection. Courage to feel what has been numbed. Courage to confront what has been normalized. Courage to surrender control where it has been defended for years. The Spirit restores freedom gradually but decisively. Each act of surrender weakens the flesh's narrative. Each choice for alignment restores clarity. Each moment of obedience rebuilds authority. This process does not erase struggle immediately, but it reorients it. Struggle becomes movement rather than stagnation. Pain becomes purposeful rather than paralyzing. True freedom is not the absence of desire, but the presence of direction. When direction is restored, desire loses its power to dominate. The flesh loses its strongest leverage. As the Spirit begins to reassert leadership in a life long governed by the flesh, one of the most unsettling experiences is the return of sensitivity. What was once numbed begins to be felt again. Conviction sharpens, awareness deepens. The inner life, once muted by habit, becomes responsive. This sensitivity can feel overwhelming at first, not because it is harmful, but because it exposes what adaptation had concealed. The flesh resists this exposure fiercely because sensitivity restores discernment, and discernment threatens control. Many people misinterpret this renewed sensitivity as regression. Old emotions resurface. Buried grief, unresolved anger, and unprocessed disappointment come back into view. The flesh uses this resurgence to argue that surrender makes things worse. In truth, surrender removes anesthesia. Pain that was hidden is now visible, not to punish, but to heal. The Spirit does not reveal wounds to shame you. He reveals them to restore integrity. At this stage, the temptation to retreat is strong. The flesh whispers that numbness was easier, that ignorance was safer, that comfort is preferable to clarity. This is one of the most critical moments in the journey. If you retreat, the flesh regains authority quickly. If you remain, even uncomfortably, authority continues to shift. Staying present becomes an act of obedience. As awareness deepens, the inner dialogue changes. Instead of reacting automatically, you begin to notice the gap between impulse and action. This gap is where freedom lives. The flesh hates this gap because it disrupts immediacy. The Spirit strengthens this space so discernment can operate. Every time you pause, instead of reacting, authority realigns. Another profound change occurs in how truth confronts desire. Desire no longer feels unquestionable. It is examined rather than obeyed. This examination weakens the flesh because desire was once its most persuasive voice. When desire is filtered through truth, its urgency fades. What once felt necessary now feels optional. This shift does not eliminate longing, but it reframes it. Longing becomes information rather than instruction. The Spirit teaches you to ask not only what you want, but where that want leads. Direction begins to matter more than relief. This reorientation dismantles the flesh's strategy of short-term satisfaction at long-term cost. As the Spirit leads more consistently, courage begins to replace avoidance. Conversations that were postponed are faced. Boundaries that were neglected are established. Decisions that were delayed are made. The flesh resists these actions because they disrupt comfort. Yet each act of courage reinforces authority. Fear loses credibility when it is confronted rather than obeyed. Another consequence of Spirit-led authority is the restoration of initiative. Flesh-led living waits for circumstances to force change. Spirit-led living moves intentionally. Initiative returns not as pressure, but as clarity. You begin to act not because you are desperate, but because you are aligned. This initiative often reveals how much life was being lived defensively. Defensive living is reactive by nature. It seeks to avoid loss rather than pursue purpose. The flesh thrives in defense because defense limits exposure. The Spirit leads offensively, not in aggression, but in purposeful movement toward calling. As authority continues to shift, the relationship with failure changes again. Failure no longer threatens identity, but it still informs direction. Mistakes are corrected without self-condemnation. Learning accelerates because shame no longer obstructs growth. The flesh relied on shame to maintain control. Without it, its influence weakens dramatically. Another area transformed is patience with process. Flesh-led authority demands immediate results to justify effort. Spirit-led authority trusts progression. Growth is no longer evaluated daily by emotion. Instead, direction is assessed over time. This long-view perspective stabilizes the inner life and reduces impulsive decisions. The Spirit also restores integrity between inner conviction and outer action. This integrity produces peace, not because life becomes easy, but because division disappears. The exhausting gap between belief and behavior narrows. Alignment increases. Energy returns because resistance decreases. As integrity strengthens, spiritual confidence emerges, not arrogance, but quiet assurance. This confidence is not rooted in self-trust, but in alignment. You trust the direction you are walking because it is no longer driven by impulse. The flesh loses influence when confidence no longer depends on outcomes. The flesh may attempt to reassert control through fatigue. Fatigue is one of its most effective tools. When tired, discernment weakens. This is why rest becomes spiritually significant at this stage. Rest is no longer escape, it is maintenance of authority. The Spirit restores strength so leadership remains stable. Rest also recalibrates perspective. Exhaustion narrows focus to survival. Rest restores the capacity to see purpose. The flesh fears rest because rest renews clarity. When clarity returns, manipulation fails. As clarity deepens, the inner narrative shifts again. Hope becomes realistic rather than idealistic. Possibility feels accessible. Change no longer feels theoretical. This hope is not emotional optimism. It is grounded expectation rooted in alignment. The Spirit restores hope by reconnecting you to direction rather than outcome. You may not see every step ahead, but you trust the path beneath your feet. This trust weakens anxiety and strengthens obedience. As obedience becomes consistent, the flesh loses its final defense, inevitability. Patterns no longer feel permanent. Change no longer feels impossible. History no longer defines destiny. Authority now flows from alignment rather than habit. This is where transformation accelerates quietly. There may be no dramatic moment, but momentum builds. Choices become easier. Discernment becomes sharper. Peace becomes more consistent. The flesh does not disappear, but it no longer governs. Its voice becomes familiar and recognizable. Its arguments lose persuasion. Authority has shifted. As authority fully transitions to spirit-led living, the most enduring change is not external behavior, but internal orientation. Life no longer feels like a constant negotiation between desire and duty. Direction becomes clearer because leadership is settled. When the Spirit leads, decisions stop being battles of will and become expressions of alignment. This is where true freedom begins, not the freedom to do whatever you want, but the freedom to live without inner division. One of the final illusions the flesh attempts to preserve is the belief that control is safety. For years, the flesh convinced you that managing outcomes, emotions, and appearances was necessary for survival. When authority shifts, this illusion collapses. You begin to see that control produced anxiety, not safety. Surrender produces peace, not vulnerability. This realization marks a profound turning point. At this stage, trust replaces vigilance, not blind trust, but grounded trust rooted in discernment. You no longer monitor yourself obsessively, fearing failure. Instead, you remain attentive without anxiety. The Spirit does not require hypervigilance. He requires awareness. Awareness keeps leadership intact without exhausting the soul. This awareness reshapes how challenges are faced. Difficulties no longer threaten identity. They test alignment, not worth. When setbacks occur, they are processed without panic. The flesh once framed difficulty as proof of inadequacy. The Spirit reframes it as confirmation that growth is ongoing. Another deep shift appears in how success is interpreted. Success no longer defines identity or value. It becomes feedback rather than validation. This removes pressure and purifies motivation. When success is no longer needed to prove worth, ambition becomes healthier and more sustainable. The flesh strongly resists this redefinition because it thrived on conditional worth. Conditional worth made people manipulable. When worth becomes stable, manipulation loses power. The Spirit restores authority by anchoring worth beyond performance. As leadership stabilizes, consistency replaces intensity. Spiritual life stops being cyclical bursts of effort followed by exhaustion. It becomes steady, resilient, and sustainable. This consistency weakens the flesh more than dramatic effort ever could. The flesh can survive intensity. It cannot survive persistence rooted in alignment. Another marker of this stage is clarity in boundaries. Boundaries are no longer enforced out of fear, but chosen out of wisdom. Saying no becomes easier because direction is clearer. Yes becomes more meaningful because it is intentional. The flesh once blurred boundaries to maintain access. The Spirit clarifies them to protect alignment. Relationships continue to adjust. Some connections deepen because they were rooted in truth. Others fade because they were sustained by dependency or compromise. This is not loss, it is refinement. The flesh fears refinement because it reduces influence. The Spirit welcomes it because it strengthens integrity. At this point, the inner life becomes quieter, not empty, but settled. Noise diminishes because fewer internal arguments remain unresolved. This quietness is not withdrawal from life, it is presence within it. You engage more fully because you are less divided internally. The flesh may attempt one final strategy: nostalgia. It reminds you of familiar patterns, former comforts, and old identities. It presents them as simpler, safer times. This nostalgia is deceptive. It omits the cost of captivity. The Spirit restores memory honestly, without romanticizing bondage. Recognizing this tactic prevents regression. Awareness preserves authority. Each time nostalgia is examined rather than indulged, alignment is reinforced. As alignment deepens, obedience becomes integrated into identity. You no longer obey merely because you should, but because obedience reflects who you are becoming. This integration is the flesh's greatest defeat. When obedience is internalized, External pressure loses relevance. The Spirit does not remove struggle entirely, but he removes confusion about who you are and where you are going. This clarity allows perseverance without despair. Even when progress feels slow, direction remains certain. This certainty transforms patience. Waiting no longer feels like stagnation. It becomes preparation. The flesh once used waiting to breed doubt. The Spirit uses it to deepen trust. As the journey continues, gratitude becomes more consistent. Not gratitude for comfort alone, but gratitude for clarity, growth, and restored authority. Gratitude stabilizes the heart and protects alignment. The flesh thrives on dissatisfaction. Gratitude starves it. Eventually, life begins to reflect internally what has already shifted spiritually. Choices align more naturally. Habits reinforce direction. Peace persists through uncertainty. This is not perfection. It is coherence. Walking in the Spirit does not make life predictable. It makes it grounded. When storms come, leadership does not change. When pressure increases, alignment holds. This stability is the fruit of restored authority. The flesh no longer controls because it no longer defines identity, direction, or worth. It may speak, but it does not lead. The Spirit leads consistently, not forcefully, but faithfully. This is the outcome of choosing alignment over impulse, surrender over control, and truth over comfort. This is what it means to walk in the Spirit, not occasionally, not ideally, but daily. If this series has helped you see clearly how the flesh gains control and how the Spirit restores true authority, subscribe to the channel so you can continue growing in clarity, strength, and Spirit-led freedom.